This is the Overton Pod. Hello, Kanthan.
Morning, John.
How are you?
I'm fit and fabulous as always. How are you doing?
Well, I'm good. This morning I went to the police station and laid a formal charge against you for treason, Kanthan. Because, of course, you've been spreading these views, otherwise known as truthful facts, on the show. And I've been alerted to this.
Not only on this show, I've actually been engaging with foreign governments on an online platform.
Yes, you've been doing that as well. And so I had to, as a dutiful citizen, I had to go lay a charge of treason against you for speaking facts about the ANC government and the GNU government as well.
So you're going to come visit me on Robben Island?
I'll come visit you on Robben Island. I'm hoping maybe Helen Ziller will give you space to hide in her house.
If she gives me refuge, yeah, because, she did give refuge to a range of people.
And then what you can do is you can call yourself a freedom fighter. And then when you come back into government...
You've got to understand, the reason why I left the country in the first place in 1986 is because I was running from the state.
Yes. Well, you can run from the state again, Kanthan. You're never too old to run from the state, really.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like...
And if you survive this whole ordeal, then you can return as the government and steal us blind for like 30 years until someone else gets upset about it and lobbies foreign governments.
Yeah, look, I clearly missed the memo when I came back to the country in 94. That was what I was supposed to be doing. And I think there were too many of us.
And on your wrist, no Breitling, no Rolex. It's very disappointing, really.
Yes, but on the other hand, I've still managed to keep my integrity and my brain. So there's that.
Yes, there is that. All right, so that's the big elephant in the room, so to speak. Obviously, of the last couple of weeks, there's a lot to talk about. But
sure,
we've got now cases of treason. Clayson Moniela is very at pains to claim that the government is not going after its critics for treason, but those cases are brought up by private individuals.
But that's kind of like the Human Rights Commission is not going after me. It's like the government is not going after me on free speech issues. It's the Human Rights Commission coming and charging me. Mm-hmm. And that's got nothing to do with the government, right? Because... Yes, it is a Chapter 9 institution.
And then, of course, when they do then investigate, it is the government. The government runs the Justice Department.
Absolutely.
And so when they investigate, that does become a government investigation. And then you are investigating your critics.
Yeah.
So
look, just in terms of stuff that should not be brought up via the courts and actually ends up in the courts simply because of the fact that people weaponize the justice system. And you commented on X about a very specific case that has been going on now for a couple of years that has finally been brought to a close, which I think is significant to talk about. And I think we should start off with that. What do you think?
Yeah, let's talk about it. You're referring, obviously, to the case against Dr. Peter Beale.
Absolutely, yes. Now, at the time when this case broke, and I was doing my tour of duty at ENCA, and, where... I brought their viewership up to 50% from 30%.
Yes. When you did a good job and then they fired you.
When basically. I did a good job and they fired me.
Yeah.
But that was one of the stories that came up at the time. And I remember making the case to the news team out there. This is a terrible idea. Mm-hmm. The idea that you can actually end up charging a doctor for doing his job. Mm-hmm. But weaponizing the justice system. So maybe you want to just give us some background about this and actually touch on it.
Sure, yeah. So Peter Beale and a gentleman by the name of Abdullah Munshi both originally were charged with this murder charge. And ultimately the Beale case came down to three patients, for which he was charged with murder of. But just to go back a little bit, what's meant to happen from a medical practice perspective is doctors are obviously human. They make mistakes. They can do things wrong. They can be negligent. And there's a system to deal with that. And that system, relatively simply, is that they register with a regulatory body, being the Health Professions Council, and the public can sort of go through the Health Professions Council to make claim against those doctors in their professional capacity. And then obviously there are civil remedies within the courts as well to rectify any thing that may have gone wrong. So if a doctor has been negligent and has then injured someone and they can't walk for the rest of their life, for example, then there might be a civil finding against them. And in fact, all doctors carry medical insurance for that purpose, because things can go wrong, you can get sued, and once lawyers are involved, maybe there's a settlement that occurs, or maybe it does go to court. Now, there was one specific case with regards to Peter Beale and Abdullah Munshi. Abdullah Munshi being an anesthesiologist and Peter Beale being a pediatric surgeon. And this patient, a child of about 10 years of age, passed away under their care. So a surgery was performed, a post-operative complication occurred, and unfortunately, despite very good and best efforts, specifically on Dr. Munshi's part, that child passed away, tragically. And there were political connections involved there, and a lot of processes were skipped. And instead of it going through the HPCSA, instead of proper inquest dockets being done,
so
etc.
I think you need to explain to people what the HPCSA is.
Well, the Health Professions Council is where every doctor is registered. You may not practice in the country without that, without that registration. And they govern all of the practice of not only doctors, of dentists, of physiotherapists, most health standardized sort of Western health professions run through there. And when a death like this occurs, there's meant to be an inquest and there's meant to be a process that's followed. And unfortunately, in this case, that didn't occur as per normal. And essentially, this was escalated to murder. Now, the problem is that murder has very real definitions in our law. One of the things you require to be considered guilty of murder is intent.
Yes, mens rea.
That's right. And so I'm not a lawyer, and I am more than happy for lawyers to correct me. But that's one of the things. No, but
it's an important point, because it was crucial in terms of why Jacob Zuma was not convicted of rape.
And it's very important when prosecutors bring certain charges. Why do they bring culpable homicide, not murder, for example?
Yes.
All right. And so the finding that occurred yesterday. So first, I need to say that Abdullah Munshi was gunned down, murdered, assassinated. In afternoon traffic. Someone bumped into the back of him. He got out to see what was going on, and he was shot several times and killed. My opinion, and the opinion of, I think, a lot of people looking at that, is that it was a hit. He was taken out. He was a decent man who didn't deserve that, and who basically every finding since the case and since his death has shown that he did nothing wrong.
Him. Yes, absolutely.
So it's incredibly sad that he was killed, and it's a terrible indictment on our society that we allow doctors to be murdered in broad daylight because people have disagreements with them, and there is no follow-up to that. No one's been arrested for his murder. I don't even think they know or have any leads. I don't think it's been chased at all. And that's a horrible indictment. On the finding with regards to Peter Beale, I think it's really important that he was found not guilty of murder. And the reason for that is that what would have happened had he been found guilty is that doctors would have looked at patients and started assessing risk of being essentially sent to prison for their life for murder.
Absolutely, because if you look at a person and you think that there's a possibility that this person is not going to survive treatment.
Correct.
Even if it's a remote possibility that the person's not going to survive treatment. If there's the threat of being charged with murder in the event of the patient dying under your care,
you don't take the risk.
You don't take the risk. So you're effectively going to back out from doing
high-risk procedures.
High-risk procedures, just and that means that more people are going to die as a result. So it was a terrible idea to start off with. Especially since there are legal processes in place to ascertain whether doctors have been negligent or deliberately negligent.
Doctors who have been like that, and my opinion is that no doctor wakes up in the morning wanting to hurt a patient. Yes. Are there people out there who are bad people who happen to be doctors? I'm sure. Are there negligent doctors? Certainly, the case records show that. But what I'm saying is no one wakes up in the morning going, I'm going to go to my practice this morning or the hospital this morning to harm people. Okay, now we know there are famous episodes in history, Shipman being the one in the UK that's particularly famous, who were psychopaths, who were murdering people. But I'm talking about your average normal doctors, not a sociopath, psychopath. No one's trying to harm anyone. And so harm does sometimes happen, and there are processes, as you mentioned, that are followed. There are doctors who've been struck off, prevented from practicing, been put under supervised practice, been fined, been made to pay millions of rands. All of these things have occurred. If they're done in the right way, they need to happen because there have to be safeguards.
Sure, but I think the basic thing that we need to agree upon, the framework needs to be that criminal law should never be brought to bear against health professionals unless it is the outcome of a substantive inquiry that comes from the Health Professionals Council itself, simply.
I think that's correct. And look, again, it's lawfare as a theme, right?
Yes.
And we've seen this repeat itself. And I think the message is that lawfare never works to anyone's favor, and most negatively to society's favor. We've seen lawfare in American politics. We've seen lawfare occur in South Africa, even against a person you might bring up, Zuma. The reality is that has caused more trouble for the country than it's been worth causing against the man. And to be frank, he's free as a bird today without any issues. You need to be very, very careful when you weaponize the law. And I agree with you. My view is that this was weaponization of the law, inappropriate application of the law. And I'm just very grateful that the court has come to this finding, because I think that will be better for society.
You know, I'm reminded of a tale, and just do a segue for a couple of minutes out here around something that happened to me when I was a young journalist. I was 20 years old at the time, and this was in Durban, and there was a crowd on a sidewalk in Durban, and I approached them, and there was a guy who was on the sidewalk, and his chest was covered with blood, and it was very clear to me that this guy had been stabbed. And so I did the quick thing, which is to push through there, find a likely suspect and say, hey, there's a public phone around the corner there. Go and make a call. Call 10-111. Tell them we need an ambulance. It's on the corner of Grey Street and Carlisle Street. Go and tell them that. It's a free call. Go do it. So that person goes off, and meanwhile I'm ripping the guy's shirt open, and there's a bunch of stab wounds around. And then and I'm trying to work out how to actually stop this guy's bleeding between, before the ambulance actually gets there. And then someone from the crowd tells me, if you pinch each of those wounds and hold it between your fingers for a couple of minutes, it'll slow down the bleeding. So I did that, and I was pinching these wounds, and sure enough, it allowed the blood to clot just a little bit. So obviously it didn't stop the bleeding, but it
wasn't so severe.
It wasn't so severe, and by the time I'd finished to the third one, because ambulance were actually efficient back then, the ambulance was on the scene, and they picked up the guy and they took him to hospital. And so then I stood up and I asked the guy who had told me to do this, how did you know how to do this? And he said, I'm a doctor. And at the time, I got incredibly upset with him. In fact, I told him to get the fuck out of there, because I was actually furious with him.
Yeah.
And then I discovered later that, in fact, if he had interceded and been treating, and this was not his patient, he could then have been held liable for stuff actually coming down, which is an absurdity. And it turns out this is the case in many parts of the world.
It is indeed.
So there's a Good Samaritan law in the U.S. that says that if you help someone, you're okay, unless you're a health professional, in which case you're not allowed to.
So we don't have the Good Samaritan law. I think most doctors in South Africa are quick to help and don't actually worry about legal jeopardy. with regards to being assisting. But, I know once I was on an aircraft where they asked for a doctor, and there was an American doctor and a South African doctor, and the American doctor didn't want to give any advice, didn't want to say anything, didn't really want to be involved. He'd come forward because he felt he needed to, but he was terrified of actually making any decisions. And the South African doctor made all the decisions.
Sure.
And the reason for that is because the Americans are constantly terrified. You talk about healthcare costs, and this is not something Doge will get to, but the reality is one of the reasons for healthcare costs in the United States is because of litigation.
Yes.
So if in South Africa we might do a chest x-ray on a patient to make a diagnosis, in America they will do a chest x-ray and a CT scan, because there's been one case somewhere along the way where someone didn't do a CT scan, they missed something on the chest x-ray, and then that patient sued for millions, and so it's not everyone's covering their ass, so they then do CT scans. That means an additional cost of thousands of dollars on every single case like that, for example. And there are thousands of examples that you can bring up like that.
But the basic underlying lesson that we've got is that the point at which the lawyers enter the fray, and then you put in place legal impediments to people being able to do their jobs freely and fairly.
Yeah, with the best intent.
It's bad for society, yes.
With the best intent. I think often the intentions of the lawyers, of the legal system, of politicians who make the law is to try and protect people in some respects. But the reality is that unless it's a very obvious action which was intended to harm, those are the original laws we have. Don't murder, don't steal.
Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal.
The Ten Commandments is pretty timeless. And the reality is we often add things onto that which are more a hindrance than a help to the functioning of a society.
So the fundamental thing in the Beal case, to go back to it, was not the fact that it was a member of the public that was proceeding with a civil claim for negligence, which would have been perfectly in order, and everyone has the right to do that. But this was the weaponizing of state resources in order to exert a particular vendetta against a doctor. But the repercussions, had it actually gone through, would have been
for the entire medical profession
and for the South African
whole population.
Public. Yeah, the entire South African public. It would have been terrible. So now the question, of course, now brings us to treason, doesn't it?
Sure, let's go straight back to treason.
Okay, so essentially, and obviously we haven't seen dockets yet, but we do know that particular politicians have gone through and laid charges of treason against South Africans for expressing opinions outside the country. Is that a fair assessment of where we are right now?
I think that's a perfectly fair assessment. And if you haven't been paying attention, basically there's a delegation from Solidariteit and AfriForum in the United States meeting with the Trump administration, not directly with Trump, and I haven't seen any photos with any senior members, so no Marco Rubio, no J.D. Vance, etc. But they're meeting with officials of that administration to explain what, from their perspective, is going on in South Africa. If you look at the stuff they've put out into public, there is nothing there which isn't factual. It's all fact. You might not like the way they've put it, but they've said things like the government has passed an expropriation bill with the intent of taking land for no money. The Expropriation Act clearly says the government can take land and property, any property, for nil. So that's a true statement. They've said things like there are laws which directly discriminate against people based on their race. I think we know that those are facts.
Yes.
All right. So, and of course the freakouts happened here because there was something really brilliant. It's James Marburg from Politics Web. Tweeted in Politics Web's account. I assume it's him, and if it's not him, whoever the social media person running that account is really needs a raise. But they said that the ANC has been running 2 television channels for 30 years.
Yes.
Did you see this tweet?
I did see this tweet, and it was very cleverly put. Yes.
And basically, on Channel 1, has been this transmission about how South Africa is a transforming country, but we all love each other and we're diverse and everything's shana, and the ANC has saved everyone from apartheid and everything is just great and they're champions of human rights, etc. That's Channel 1. And that's what the world has been watching for 30 years. And so no one's ever said anything because it's amazing. It's like watching heaven on television. And Channel 2 is this broadcast about how the government has systematically been destroying human rights and been shitting all over the Constitution for 30 years and actually have gone out of their way to behave exactly in the same way as the government before them as much as they can. Now, obviously, not completely. I'm not calling them the apartheid government, but there are certain things that are clearly there. Even laws still on the books from apartheid being used in reverse. And so that's on Channel 2. And up until now, nobody's been tuned in to Channel 2. And what's happened with the new Trump administration and the focus on South Africa is that America is now watching Channel 2.
Well, the truth is Channel 2 has always been there, because there's been the statements that have been issued from the official political platforms of the government, and then there are the statements that have been issued on behalf of the party. And so what our president, for example, has said in his capacity of the person delivering the State of the Nation address versus the person who's delivering the address to the African National Congress are two entirely different things. And for the first time, we've actually seen a paper trail around how all of the utterances and all of the policy positions that have been outlined in the various ANC policy documents over the years and documented on their website have systematically been brought into law behind the scenes. You know, it's what David Bullard always refers to as boiling the frog.
Yes.
And this has been a systematic
which
ongoing
is an
process.
alleged Ramaphosa quote. Is there any veracity to that?
I don't know. I never actually followed it up.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's sort of fake news, but the allegation being that Cyril once upon a time said that the way you change things in South Africa, and he was kind of speaking about how you change sort of white rule and white wealth, etc. Allegedly, because
Yes.
I haven't seen the exact clip or the transcript. Is that it's like boiling a frog in pot of water. Is that initially the frog's chilling in cold water, and the heat is quite cool, and then you turn it up a little bit, and the frog thinks, "Oh, this is a warm bath," and then you turn it up a bit more, and it's like, "Oh, what a lovely jacuzzi," and then by the time the frog's boiling, obviously, it's too late in the game.
Yes, I don't know whether it was actually something that Cyril said, but the analogy is very real.
Yes,
because there has been that steady eroding of any principles of equality and meritocracy, and instead it's been replaced by this concept of equity and redistribution and all of these types of things.
which also have been popular buzzwords of the West for decades now.
Yes.
Redistribution is not only a South African
Which is
thing.
why, to go back to Channel 1 and Channel 2, remember that there has been this constant amplification of all of the Channel 1 narratives, but there's been a complete refusal on the part of the global media to in any way visit what has been happening on Channel 2. So everything, for example, in terms of the rise of crime in South Africa, the blatantly violent nature of crime that has taken place since the ANC has come into power, the obvious brutality that's associated with that crime, and then the complete ignoring of very specific categories of crime and refusing to refer to them, and farm murders being a very specific example of this.
Yes, and the unexplained purposeful removal of methods to combat those issues. So with regards to farm murders, the fact that the South African police services specifically withdrew their specialized units which were involved in preventing those attacks from occurring.
Yes.
You kind of think to yourself, well, unless you wanted it to happen, why would you do something like that?
Well, the city of Johannesburg has now passed a bylaw that criminalizes putting up closed-circuit TV cameras.
Is it passed?
I believe that it has been passed last week, yes.
Yeah, I don't even know where to begin with this stuff.
So, and of course, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what possible motivation could you have for saying that people should not be putting up cameras on their property to see who's attempting to break into their property?
Mm-hmm.
Because, clearly if there are violations of privacy that go with making use of videos that are captured in public, there are already existing laws by which one could bring into account. You could certainly sue someone for a violation of privacy if they sneak up on you in your car, for example, and record your conversation.
If I put a video of you walking past my house
Yes.
and I put that online and I say this man broke into my home and it's a false statement, then defamation laws
Absolutely,
will
yes.
protect you.
So there already is protection for members of the public in terms of images that are captured in public. So you have to ask yourself, why is there the systematic undermining of the ability of people to actually defend themselves, their families, and their property?
Yeah.
And the answer that I'm forced to draw is that there's a systematic promotion of criminality with the idea of undermining the fabric of society.
Yeah, and this is the problem. Logically, that's where you lead,
Yes.
right? And so now to continue the analogy or to refer to another fable, you have these guys now making the case overseas because you have an American administration that's listening and that's interested and that's focused. I still think they focus for very different reasons. So I understand that at the moment the focus, the spotlight is on the Afrikaner, so to speak. But I really do believe this has got to do with our foreign international relations, and specifically what we did with regards to Iran and the ICJ, etc., what we may have given Iran. But what's quite incredible to me is that we move from the frog boiling in the pot of water to the frog offering the scorpion a ride across the river. And halfway across the river, for those of you who don't know, there's a frog and a scorpion and they're on the bank of a river. And the scorpion says to the frog, "Please will you take me to the other side? I can't swim." And the frog says, "I can't take you to the other side because if you're on my back and you sting me halfway through, I'll drown." And the scorpion says, "Yes, but if you drown, I'll drown too." And the frog thinks about it and goes, "All right, that seems reasonable. Why would the scorpion do something that would kill itself?" And so the scorpion climbs onto the frog's back and they start swimming across the river. And halfway across the river, the scorpion stings the frog. And as the frog starts to drown and die, sort of says to the scorpion, "Why? Why would you do this? You're also going to die now." And the scorpion says, "Well, it's in my nature."
It's in my nature.
And the ANC, it is so simple to solve this problem. Trump comes out and he's clearly aggressive towards the country. The way to deal with this is to de-escalate. The way to deal with it is to engage diplomatic channels, but also openly say, "We want to work with you. We understand you're concerned about things. We'd like to fix things. You can even say something like, we'd be willing to relook at the EWC bill." Just use those words. Don't do anything. There's no action required. Just say it. We're withdrawing our case from the ICJ, or we're no longer pursuing it. You've already gone far enough. You've already got the kudos for doing that if you wanted them. No, instead of all of that, the ANC government tells Donald Trump, "Bring it. Come. We're not afraid of you. We can't be bullied by you." I mean, you can. He's a 7-foot child with a baseball bat and a knuckle duster on the playground, and you're about 2 feet tall. But not only do they say that to him, they also go, "We're not going to change any laws. Everything we're doing is 100% right. So screw you. It's our country. We'll do as we please." Of course, we know that always works out well. And then, Kanthan, the scorpion stinging the frog. This week, they post pictures onto social media about how they're meeting with Iran and making deals with Iran. And it's just like, It's unbelievable.
So I don't think we should conflate these issues because, I'm big on sovereignty, and am I of the view that we should be free to make deals with Iran as long as they're within the constraints of international law? Absolutely right. What I do have a problem with is the way in which we have a government that is deliberately sabotaging the interests of the country by failing to take into account the fact that those actions have consequences that are going to impact the economy overall. So do we have the right to talk to Iran? Absolutely. Is this something that we need to be flaunting in the face of the Americans?
Exactly.
No.
And now, specifically.
These are discussions that can take place behind the scenes. Look, we have vested interests in terms of Iran. Because remember, up until the time of Trump reintroducing sanctions against Iran and pulling out of the Iranian nuclear deal, South Africans, a number of companies, had made substantial investments in Iran, on the good faith understanding that Iran was now back in the family of nations. And there were opportunities there where there were solid South African businesses that, MTN, for example, had a substantial investment in Iran, which they've not been able to recoup because the country has been sealed off from the rest of the world. The pathway to us being able to realize the benefits of those investments in Iran is to actually recognize that there's a process that's currently underway involving the Trump administration and Iran. And the best possible thing that can be done right now is to actually have a negotiation with the Trump administration to say, look, we have these investments in Iran, and we have every interest in your reaching an accommodation with them to bring them back into the family of nations. And how can we assist in actually fast-tracking this process? Can we potentially play the role of being an intermediary between the U.S. government and Iran instead of you needing to go to someone like Russia, for example, in order for us to get the best possible outcome for all of us? That would be the solid, sensible thing to do in national interest. And we have a fundamental failure of our government to be able to recognize that diplomacy ultimately is going to be in the best interests of our country. I cannot understand why there is this deliberate sabotaging of the country at every conceivable level.
Let's talk about that, because I think that's a key. I think that's the key point, and you brought it up with the units that have been removed. You brought it up with the CCTV thing. I brought it up with the Iran thing, and you've expanded on that. That's what it is. It's we're accusing a couple of guys in America talking to people of treason, but the ANC is directly sabotaging the country. Is it because, I mean, as far as I can tell, from my perspective, it seems as if when the election happened and the ANC dropped to 40%, and I think that needs to be remembered, the ANC only got 40% of the vote. I think there was a panic that occurred. And I think that, I know, the ANC has something called the National Democratic Revolution. They've been trying to implement that. Every government document has 2030 on it.
Correction, they have been implementing
They have been implementing it, yes.
Successfully.
It's not something that happens overnight.
Yes.
It's a process. But I think they looked at it and thought, we don't know how much longer we will be in power, at least democratically. Once the National Democratic Revolution's in full, it's not democratic in any kind of way. And revolutions are usually not things that are controllable in terms of the outcomes that occur, that follow that. But the idea is, while we have power, while we are still being democratically elected, we need to push through as much as we can, because otherwise we're going to lose power. So on one side, they think maybe some of these policies will actually be popular amongst people. NHR, for example. On the other side, it's a way of trying to retain power and make sure that they can't really lose it in future. So EWC is an example of that. Bella, which controls education, is an example of that. We have had more communist policy passed in the past 10, 11 months than we have had in the past decade and a half, roughly.
So we also need to remember that the three core laws that are at hand right now. So we've got Bella, we've got EWC, and we've got NHI. And all three of those were ramrodded through Parliament ahead of the elections because it was very clear that the ANC was aware that they were going to be potentially compromised following the elections, and it turned out that they were right. Ramaphosa then simply rubber-stamped those, and, to be fair, there was not much that the DA could do to stop Ramaphosa from signing off on those particular bills. But the situation that we have right now is that those are effectively law. In order for us to be able to overturn those laws, we need enough opposition in Parliament to be able to do that, and we're not going to be able to do that. Now, if we had a situation where we did not have a compromised judiciary, then those laws would fail the means test.
Yes.
Just in terms of constitutionality. However, we very clearly do have a compromised judiciary which is committed to the race-based insanity that we fought against under apartheid to start off with. And so there's little chance right now that any of those will be successfully challenged in court, which means that on an ongoing basis, the ability of a democratic outcome in terms of those particular laws. And again, surveys have shown over and over again that the majority of South Africans want a meritocracy. Nobody wants race-based laws. They want equality of opportunity. And currently, right now, it's very clear that opportunity is reserved for a particular section of the ruling class. And yes, the majority of people don't want that. But when you don't have the means of getting Parliament to actually implement the will of the people, what are the options that are then left to you? Because clearly the legal processes are not in a position to work. So you can either subvert the law and effectively break the law and, start doing things behind the scene, which to my mind would be real undermining of the fabric of society. Or you can actually lobby on every conceivable platform for pressure to be brought upon the government to effect change. And I think at that level, what is being done by the likes of Solidariteit and AfriForum has been very much to try and bring pressure to restore what is effectively what most of the people in this country would like to have, which is a prosperous country where they are not being in a frog and scorpion scenario. Right now, we are in a frog and scorpion scenario. So, one of the things that came out yesterday was the latest Stats SA figures in terms of our economic growth. Oh. And our economic growth for the past quarter was 0.6%.
Yeah, I was going to say 0.7, yeah.
Yeah, 0.6%. Now, 0.6% is not sustainable. And it's not sustainable simply because I've said before, the route to prosperity is your economic growth has to exceed your population growth. Now, we're going backwards. So the country is getting poorer constantly. But the thing that I now want to clamp down on, and I want to urge everyone out there to start taking note of this. We keep hearing this particular phrase that comes out from every single economist that gets trotted out on every platform. We need to have inclusive growth for the country.
We don't.
We need growth. We don't need inclusive growth. We need growth.
What do you think they mean by inclusive growth, Kanthan?
Inclusive growth means that you tweak the system and you clamp down on capitalism being able to do what it does best. So let's remind ourselves that up until from the period from 1999 to 2007, when Thabo Mbeki was running the country, we had the best economic growth that this country has ever seen. Why? Because we didn't have any of the race-based laws that were actually preventing the country from growing. And what that meant was because of the fact that economic growth was through the charts, it meant that there was enough money left over as profit for us to then plow into social grants, and the country was better off as a result. Whatever you're feeling on social grants, okay? I mean, personally, I'm not a fan of social grants, but the fact is that we were paying social grants at the time because we could afford to. Why could we afford to? Because we had growth. Why did we have growth? Because we did not have the hidden tax of all of the race-based laws that prevented business from actually flourishing, from being a meritocracy. Ultimately, if you remove these race-based laws,
everyone does better.
Everyone does better. More money flows into the government, and then the government is able to distribute that money in favor of uplifting people. Now, right now, we've got the ridiculous situation where we are borrowing money in order to pay social grants, and we are putting these artificial constraints on businesses, preventing them from growing the economy in the name of inclusive growth. So I want to appeal to people. Every time someone turns around and says inclusive growth, smack them down in public.
Well, I would appeal to people to do that again and again on any word where there's some conjunction added which is unnecessary.
Like social justice as opposed to justice.
There you go. So inclusive growth, there's no such thing. There's growth or no growth. Those are your options. Justice, there's justice or there's no justice. Injustice. There is no such thing as social justice. When you tag on something else to a word that has a very clear, defined meaning, is one of the first words in the English language, has been for thousands of years. You are trying to pervert the language, and you are trying to pervert the meaning of that very important word. And, social justice is one that I've had a problem with for a very long time. There is no such thing as social justice. There is only justice. Why? Because our society says every single person is equal under the law. If you add on things like social justice, you imply that some people are more equal than others, which is exactly what purveyors of social justice will tell you. Because so-and-so had a bad upbringing, came from a horrible place, was poor, etc., they should have more rights than someone who didn't have that experience. That is not how justice works. Everyone is equal before the law, beginning and end. The same with this inclusive growth thing. There is no such thing. There is only growth. The issue I have is we have a country where there are enough smart people, entrepreneurial people, who really could make our economy fly. But we're constantly not allowed to do this because there's a whole bunch of rules in the way that say, for example, if you were going to be the Elon Musk of mining, for example, but you were white, that wouldn't work anymore in this country. So instead of you ending up as some billionaire mining magnate and employing 150,000 people who in turn fed 400,000 people. You couldn't do that because, sorry, you're the wrong skin color. We have to get away from that. Now, the Americans can see that that's a problem. People in other parts of the world can see it's a problem. I had a conversation with a mate who lives in the UK, South African, and he's moved there. He loves South Africa still, prefers it here, will end up moving back here, but is there for his kids currently. And he said, when you talk to someone in the UK and you explain BEE to them, they don't understand. Like they cannot conceive of what you are saying. It's so foreign to them as a concept. When you tell them that, look, you started a business selling such and such a product, but then you were unable to grow the business or get contracts because they asked you what color your skin was, and then wouldn't buy your product, even though you might sell the best product or be the only one selling that product, etc. It's such a foreign concept. We are so broken in this country in terms of understanding that a lot of these ideas are very, very backwards. They've tried to put some of these ideas into the United States, for example, and they've now been wholly rejected. It's just astonishing. We run a country that's been not just implementing some of these ideas, but has been the tip of the spear. And this is why we get all the NGO money for this kind of stuff, because we are the testing lab for a lot of these very, very bad ideas. And exactly as you say, until we're willing to release the shackles. And I think the point you make about the internal mechanisms to solve this problem should be a democratic election. You vote people out. Unfortunately, we're getting close, although some will argue against that, because theoretically, if you add the EFF, MK, and ANC together, you still have a giant block of black nationalism to an extent. But we certainly are getting close to one of those parties being removed.
But look, I'm not really afraid of one giant block of black nationalism, because I'm very clear, for example, that you're not going to have a scenario where you are going to have the majority of the populace of this country being happy with MK, for example, which at its core fundamentally are Zulu nationalists.
Yeah.
And you're not going to have a situation where everyone else in the country is going to be comfortable with the idea of Zulu nationalists dominating the political arena. So I'm far less concerned about a situation where MK is a sizable player in government. MK needs to get to the point where it is a sizable player in government, because that is going to have them in the tent pissing out and not outside pissing in, which is what they are doing right now. And more to the point, stirring up lots of social unrest in the course of actually doing so. I do think, though, that we should not be as scared of the threat of black nationalism as much as the current situation that we are, where we have these NGOs who are dictating policies that ultimately are increasing poverty in our country. And, so the just energy transition, which Ramaphosa keeps talking about, there's no such thing as a just energy transition. It is the most unjust thing that exists out there.
Again, there's those words tagged on.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Either you're doing an energy transition or you're not doing an energy transition.
But we don't need an energy transition. Let's be very clear. We need energy.
That's right.
Okay, energy. That is what is going to drive the economy.
And the best form of energy in South Africa?
It's going to be the coal that's under our feet.
100%. And the second best energy in South Africa?
Is going to be the gas that's off our shores.
That's right. And the third best is if we'd finally invest in nuclear.
And let's not forget the gas under the Karoo that's there for fracking as well.
I know, but Kanthan, there's a beautiful telescope and lots of solar panels there. So we couldn't possibly have a fracking well of about an acre large. I mean, that would just be untenable.
Well, also right now, we currently do have a gas pipeline that comes across from Mozambique. And I do know, for example, that there was a plan. So understand that those gas pipelines end up terminating in Ekurhuleni. And I do know of one business person who ran a gas line very specifically from Ekurhuleni right through to the heart of Sandton and is able to bring a 500 megawatt gas-powered turbine into the heart of Sandton. And as you know, because it's gas-powered, it's not going to be emitting pollutants into the air because it's basically water vapor that's going to be coming out of there, and carbon dioxide, of course. But there's nothing poisonous. There's no acid rain, none of that kind of stuff. And effectively, you have 500 megawatts that you then drop into the heart of Sandton. And the knock-on effect in terms of the entire economy of Gauteng would be phenomenal. Why is it actually not possible for this to happen? Because we have the ANC that is concerned with a just energy transition. Instead of saying, we need energy to grow this economy. Trump gets this because his entire efforts so far have been devoted to lowering the cost of energy. What's the most critical thing he needs energy for? It's for AI. Because he's quite determined that the US is going to be the 800-pound gorilla in the room in terms of AI. And right now, they are that. No matter what people might be saying about
He also realizes, which, again, no one in our government has realized, including smart people. This is not just an ANC problem. Dion George is the Minister of Environment, Fisheries and Forestry. Okay, Dion George has been in interviews and penned articles since he became that minister, bemoaning that we're not doing enough for climate change. And when Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords, he bemoaned the effect that would have on the climate and how important those accords were. And even though those accords literally tie our hands as South Africa and limit our economic growth, he bemoaned that. He bemoans the fact that just energy transition might be affected because America's not putting any money towards that anymore. Bearing in mind, on the ANC side, the just energy transition is a money grab. Okay, it's at least $9 billion, which was promised, and the ANC just
in loans.
Well, but it doesn't matter because it's $9 billion in an account somewhere, and then the ANC gets to line up outside Louis Vuitton, etc., on the weekend and buy whatever they want, right? So that's how the ANC views it. But the DA actually thinks the just energy transition is something. They actually think it's a real thing. These are people who should know better, but who clearly don't, and who haven't once considered what we could do with gas, what we should be doing with coal, how we should be considering nuclear. The DA should be turning around and going, we don't really want Russia to build our nuclear power stations, and these are the reasons why, if they don't like Russian suppliers, which they obviously won't because they have to wave the Ukrainian flag currently. But why can't they support EDF from France doing it? Why can't they support the Americans doing it? Again, we talk about the bungle that the ANC has made of this diplomacy. But Ryan Coetzee, as the leader of the DA, in case you didn't know, Ryan Coetzee has completely...
Actually, can you touch on that a bit? Because I've been hearing a lot of that from my sources as well.
Yeah, so quickly, just on the side of how the DA should have dealt with this American thing. You have the world's greatest superpower against the ANC, against the policies of the ANC, all of which are destructive and limit economic growth. And instead of the DA going, hi, we're the former opposition, we're in government, we're trying to influence them the right way, we'd love your help, we'd love to partner with you, say something like, we can't wait for America to help us with our energy. We've got fossil fuels here and we want to build nuclear. We'd love for you to help. Say something like that. It's never going to happen anyway because you don't control the power enough for it to happen. But say it. Get on the right side of the Trump administration. No. The whole DA, orange man bad. They cannot do it. It is just the most unbelievable cock-up.
But more to the point, let's actually take a look in terms of the global economy right now, because this is not about the Trump administration. This is what the Russians are doing. This is what the Chinese are doing. This is what the Indians are doing.
The biggest growing economies, China and India.
And this is now what the Americans are doing. Okay, so effectively, you've got the top 4 economies in the world, which is the United States, followed by China, followed by India, followed by Russia. And they are all committed to the path of maximizing the use of fossil fuels in the interests of uplifting their citizens.
That's right.
And what impact is tiny South Africa going to make on global carbon dioxide output?
Negligible.
So what are we doing? And it has to come back to the question of who is funding these initiatives and providing the incentive to our politicians to do this, and then more crucially to recognize that the overall impact of this is to keep this country in poverty. Because energy costs are the single thing that are going to uplift people immediately. Look, I mean, we've got something like a 4% decrease in the price of fuel kicking in tonight at the time that we're recording this. Yeah, a 4 cent per liter decrease in the price of fuel. But that is probably the single thing, the single biggest cost that people have in their lives. No matter who you are, fuel costs are probably the single biggest cost on your budget.
Absolutely.
More so than food.
We've said this again and again on the show, but even in the short term, yes, we should be drilling for oil and gas, and we should be refining it, and we should be lamenting the fact that we closed down refineries here, and we should be attracting that type of investment, and we should be telling the greenies worried about 20 whales out of 20 million in the sea to get over themselves. But in the short term, if we had just said to the Trump administration, either as the GNU, the ANC, the DA, anything, hey, yeah, we see your point on all of that stuff. We'd love to have discussions about it. We don't want to fight with you. And we're open to discussion on that. Yeah, you're right. The EWC bill may have some areas of concern, and we do also have those concerns. We've just done that. The rand would probably be at 17.50, a full rand less than it is currently.
Immediately.
Right? And investor confidence in this country would be currently higher than it is. And that would result not in a 4-cent decrease in fuel tonight. That would be resulting in a 40-cent decrease in fuel tonight.
But I want to go back to this point that I was making, that I don't want us to make the focus on the Trump administration.
Yeah.
Because, again, look in terms of the ANC's perspective, if you don't want to take advice from the Trump administration, okay, by all means, take it from China, take it from India, because
and Russia.
But look,
who are all your friends?
I'll remove Russia from the list simply because if you look in terms of our top trading partners as South Africa right now,
it's China and America.
It's China and America and India. So those are our top trading partners. Why are we not following their example? So if you want to remove America from the equation, follow what China is doing. Follow what India is doing. How difficult is this?
Yeah, and that's why we get back to the sabotage. Because it seems to me that it's very obvious what you should be doing. Even the people you like are doing that thing. So you don't have to copy your enemies, although you should certainly copy your enemies if they're doing smart things. But you could just copy your friends. More so, you could ask your friends to do it for you. The Chinese would love to come here and build 10 coal power plants. Love it. They would happily do that. They would bring in their own people, their own building materials, all the rest of it, and they would build you as many coal-powered power plants as you wanted. They're pretty good at it because they're building 300 of them in about 3 years.
But more to the point, you know that South African businesses are sitting on a lot of cash. And the reasons why they're sitting on a lot of cash is because there's no profitable way to invest it currently. Mm-hmm. Why is there no profitable way to invest it? Exactly because of all of the regulatory hurdles and all of the race-based laws that prevent you actually kicking it off. If you were to build another Sasol, for example, as at the most basic level, so let's leave aside coal-fired electrical power plants because, recognize that fuel costs, we import something like 500,000 barrels of oil per day in order to keep this country running. No, sorry, that's actually our consumption per day is about 500,000 barrels. And we produce 100 and something thousand barrels through Sasol currently. Mm. Building a new Sasol, could a new Sasol be profitable? Absolutely, because the cost per liter of fuel that gets produced from Sasol is significantly less than the cost that we are currently paying for importing fuel. So if we were opening up the markets and allowing people to invest in building another Sasol plant to convert more coal into fuel, the overall impact for the country is money that is currently being spent outside the country is no longer going outside the country. It's being spent inside the country to develop our infrastructure. And at the same time, the cost of fuel comes down because then you remove the regulatory hurdles. Right now, Sasol has to drastically increase its price because of the fact that the ANC government insists on this absurdity of import parity pricing, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
We should be pricing things that are produced within the country in the interests of reducing the costs for the people in this country. Basic economics.
Yes, basic economics. But you talk about those economists who toe a government line.
Because they insist on using the terminology. So again, I'm appealing to people. When you in the current context, when you hear people talking about economic growth, and when they start saying we need to do things to get inclusive growth, switch off your TV. More importantly, send through a note on your various social media platforms saying, this person is an idiot because there's no such thing as inclusive growth. There is growth.
Agreed.
Javier Milei has shown us the way.
Well, and let's talk quickly about Ryan Coetzee because you mentioned that.
Yeah, I want some of the background around this because I've been hearing behind the scenes that there's a disproportionate influence that Coetzee currently exerts
So maybe people want to know who he is.
Yes.
I think Ryan is someone who got involved with the DA quite early on, Tony Leon sort of times, and apparently a youngster at the time, in his 20s, if I'm not mistaken, at that time, and quite bright, quite talented politically, good thinker, strategic, and an advisor to Tony, an advisor to the party, and that party grew. And was then involved with the Helen Zille phase to a point. Lots of friends within the party. So you're talking about someone who was involved in the party 20 years ago and who knows everyone who occupies a position of power now. So when the FedEx of the DA meets, they're all friends of Ryan's, basically. But because he's never gone up against any of these people politically...
Does he hold any official position within the party?
No, he's a consultant to the party. He does a lot of consulting to them, and he trains a lot of their people.
And who pays his bills?
The DA.
Okay.
There's an allegation, which I have been unable to confirm, that he earns 8 million rand a year paid by the DA to him as a fee. That would mean he outstrips the earnings of anyone in the DA. And maybe it's not 8 million, but I'm sure it's not small. Because he's never gone up against anyone politically, he has no enemies. So, you had Athol Trollop, for example, and Alan Wind, not exactly the best of mates because they went up against each other for positions in the party. Helen's got her faction within the party, and there's other factions in the party because those people have fought each other politically. Ryan doesn't seem to have that baggage for obvious reasons. In the interim, he also left the country, stayed somehow very connected and on the inside, went to the UK, and was part of the Lib Dems when the Lib Dems got a decent percentage. I forget the exact percentage, but I think they got somewhere between 12 and 15% of the vote in the UK and actually won quite a few areas there. This was pre-Boris Johnson, pre-David Cameron, I think even, one of those elections, 2012, thereabouts. I forget the exact dates. He was involved with that, and he was a strategist for that party. Now, that should already send some alarm bells off because the Lib Dems are very much the left of the UK. And although Labour has shifted quite significantly to the left post-Corbyn, the Lib Dems were always more niche left than Labour. And Ryan was right in there with the Lib Dems. So firstly, the question you've got to ask is, how does a guy like that get in there? Quite interesting. Seems to have a little bit of success, but then runs the next campaign, is in fact escalated and in charge of their entire campaign for the next election, at which they completely crash out. He misreads the room completely and cocks it up. Even, UK media goes after him as having basically lost all traction that the Lib Dems had picked up. There was talk that the Lib Dems would become almost a powerful third party. Ryan managed to screw that up. He then leaves the UK at some point and goes and runs a party in Hong Kong around the time when there's all that issue going on with the Chinese, and the Chinese are trying to clamp down and take over Hong Kong.
Well, that was USAID money that was basically being pumped in to foment a color revolution in
it would
Hong
appear
Kong.
as if Ryan was taking USAID money
Interesting. Oh.
to run a color revolution.
Well, the useful thing is that there's going to be a paper trail now in terms of where that money went to. So I guess we'll find that out at the point. But just to bring it back home now.
So then he comes home after he failed. So he's failed in the UK. He's failed in Hong Kong. He still has this power, and Musi Maimane crashes out. And he comes back to South Africa, and they do this review, what went wrong. The famous DA, what went wrong. And Ryan is in the mix again because he's one of the mana. and he knows everyone, and he's such a smart guy, and he knows everything, Kanthan. So he's part of rejigging the DA and the resultant DA that we have now. And the word on the street, with good corroboration, I will say, is that Ryan is basically now running the party.
Interesting.
He's the unelected leader of the party. Big decisions, they're made by him. John is pretty much sidelined, and you have a left-wing full believer.
But hang on a second. How can you say John has been sidelined? Because I saw him unveiling a toilet in Cape Town yesterday.
No, that was Jordan Hill-Lewis, wasn't it?
No, I thought it was Steenhuisen.
No,
was it Jordan?
Jordan unfortunately did
okay.
that.
Oh, okay.
They're funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Okay, my sincere apologies to Steenhuisen for...
Steenhuisen was talking to farmers on the weekend while wearing a World Economic Forum pin, which was possibly the most stupid thing he's done. But in my view, what he's doing is he's setting himself up for life after the DA. I think John very much knows that he's got a couple of years left. He will remain as minister most likely until the DA and the ANC fake break apart in 2028, pre the 29 elections. And then he will go off into the wilderness. He's done. He knows he's done in the DA. Unfortunately, he doesn't have particularly marketable skills. Not like he came in as an economist, so he can suddenly become an economist writing for the Business Day or something, or as often happens.
Business Day still a thing?
Or whatever. Yeah, I don't keep up with mainstream media, but he's got to make something of it. And I think that he's decided that he can become some sort of global sort of diplomat of some sort, a WEF lackey, for want of a better term. And that's I think where his head is at, and he's planning for his own future, because I think politically he's been taken out. And so you have a DA which is very confused about who it is right now, and in my view has no idea what's going on in the world. They are completely unattached to what issues are popular amongst people, what issues are not popular, the things you should absolutely just be avoiding right now, the principles that have clearly been shown to fail and are now being deserted on a global scale. And it's quite sad to see, frankly.
So let me give you, again, tying in with the stuff, and by the way, the stuff you've been saying is very interesting, because I'm not privy to the inner workings of the DA, and
they leak like a.
No, I totally get that, but by and large, I'm divorced from people who are very close to the inner workings of political parties these days. It's not like the days when Julius Malema was getting regular insights from what was going on in Thule House, and that's kind of fallen by the wayside. But just to kind of pull this back at a macro level, and just swing around to geopolitics again. So I think we can broadly split the world right now, to go back to our discussion around energy, into the four big players, and we're talking the US, Russia, India, and China, who are all committed to maximizing energy outputs. And if you want to drill down into what is separating the world in geopolitics right now, there's those four significant players where maximizing access to cheap energy is their sine qua non. And then you have what used to be commonly referred to as the blob, which has now kind of coalesced between the UK and Europe, and Japan to some extent as well, as part of this coterie, who are still committed to the idea of effectively putting a brake on the advance of civilization, because energy is fundamentally all about the advance of civilization. And more crucially, are committed to doing everything in their power to promoting that agenda by spending as much money as they possibly can in pursuit of that agenda. So, you have the scenario now where you have the UK leading the charge and coming up with this idea of a coalition of the willing to keep funding the war in Ukraine. And that very same coalition of the willing is turning around and saying that they are willing to make available money in our country that has been cut off by US aid. And again, you must ask yourself, why are they wanting to do this? Well, clearly it's because they want to retain control of political narrative within this country and effectively, by doing so, to control the politics of the country. Now, it's also my view right now that the DA and the Ramaphosa ANC are effectively part of that collective because they sing from the same hymn sheet.
Yeah.
Which is why you have Ramaphosa talking about a just energy transition. And the DA is also talking about the same energy transition. I think this morning they announced a $4 billion investment in a solar project. And oh, by the way, maybe in a couple of years' time, we'll be able to afford batteries to go with it.
Oh, really? No batteries included?
No, there's no batteries.
Batteries not included. Literally, batteries not included. Yeah. That's amazing.
So, but, in this trying to make sense of the world, John, I think right now we can look at it in terms of the people who want to take us forward as a species, and energy is crucial to that.
And the people who want to hold us back.
And the people who want to hold us back. And the people who want to hold us back now are desperately clinging on to power at any cost. And I think really the path to human development is going to be to hitch onto the people who are trying to push for energizing the planet, because ultimately that's what's going to drive prosperity across the board. Just think of the impact, for example, if we had access to cheap electricity. What would that do in terms of our agricultural output? Would we be concerned about large-scale farms, or would we be able to do what the Israelis and what the Dutch do? Because, between Israel and the Netherlands, they produce more tomatoes than the rest of the world combined.
On a very small land mass. Both of those countries are quite small.
Exactly. So all of these things kind of tie in. I don't know how one actually gets to the bottom of where the money flows are currently coming in that are influencing the balance of power. So hence what you were saying about, given Ryan Coetzee's background in terms of the Lib Dems and how that would then tie in with the current agenda of the blob.
And his personal politics, he's been very clear.
Sure.
He's been very clear on hot button issues. Let's talk about.
But again, this entire concept of there being, unelected people behind the scenes who control the reins of power, and this is probably true in most places in the world. Yeah, that you do have this, behind the scenes ruling class, and we have these occasional references to the Stellenbosch mafia in our country, and I have no doubt, to a large extent, that. Old money in Stellenbosch exerts substantial political influence across the course of the country. But the way in which, to my mind, we actually extricate our country from this mess is by, as far as possible, shining the cold light of day upon where these various channels are flowing money into the country and where the various sources of influence are. And I don't know how we get from where we are right now to that point. Because unlike the situation that you have in the US, we don't now have an Elon Musk coming in and saying, here's how money is being spent.
We don't. But I think what's happening with Doge and with America cutting back on a lot of this funding, America is the nidus of where a lot of this comes from. And I don't know if you saw Musk speaking to Rogan, and he spoke about George Soros and what Soros is actually brilliant at.
Arbitrage.
Yes, arbitrage. And basically that Soros understands that you can create NGOs, and then you can get government to fund those NGOs, and you can basically get billions of dollars to mold the world in the way you want it to be outside of government with government's money. And that's what's really happened. And because America's turning those taps off now, people like Soros and others, it's not just him, will need to decide whether they want to use their own money to do this. Now, that's a bit different. I'm not sure they will want to use as much of their own money to do it when they're not using the United States government, the EU, etc. So that's of interest. The other thing that I think is of interest is you mustn't, which I wanted to get to, is you mustn't discount what's occurring with regards to Ukraine and Russia and this whole decision around that war and what happened in the Trump White House, which I'd like to get to, in terms of NATO being forced to be funded properly, and that being funds that goes maybe to NATO, to actual military weapons and things like that, versus the EU being able to siphon that money to other bullshit. Okay, because there's only so much money to go around. And the EU is not in a good place. They're not in a good place financially. Those countries are not in a good place for the most part. I saw some interesting stuff coming out of Italy, though. Their employment rate is at an all-time low under Meloni.
Unemployment rate.
Unemployment. Yes. It's a bit of a Freudian slip there with regards to the Italians, and you could probably say it about the French as well. But so there are some good signs under certain leaders and under certain policies. But the reality is, as we've discussed many times, Europe's in big trouble. Germany is the big flashing red light there, and those kinds of decisions are going to start to be made. So I think that a lot of this external funding, this external impetus, this elite class policy ideas that feed into government because they have access and they're friends and they have funding, I think that may start to come under a lot of pressure. And we'll see, because we've got Bill and Melinda Gates funding toilets in Cape Town, which of course makes them look great. And that's fine. They can fund toilets. I'm just wondering what was this quid pro quo there. But we'll see how much more of that actually happens, because I think the entire non-governmental complex industry is going to come under immense pressure in the coming years. And I don't know if you want to add to that, because I really want to talk about how that relates to Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, so the thing that I want to add to that is that, essentially non-governmental organizations that are funded by government are in fact governmental organizations.
Correct.
Except that they're working outside of the framework of government. To pull back to the question in terms of the defense funding. Now, remember that one of the most significant tasks that Trump has ahead of him in the short, 4 years that he has in order to be able to fulfill his mission is to actually get the U.S.'s debt under control. And the quickest way that he can get the U.S.'s debt under control is by doing a drastic reduction in terms of spending. Mm-hmm. Now, you consider that most of the spending that has happened from a defense point of view, I mean, the U.S., in of itself, spends more money on defense than the rest of the G7 put together. So take all of the G7, put them together, and they come out to a fraction of the U.S.'s defense spending.
This is what Trump gets so upset about.
So, but the point, more importantly, is that the way in which the U.S. is currently spending money on defense is not going to guarantee its military superiority in the years ahead, because the war in Ukraine has shown very clearly that it's not about tanks. You always hear... so Keir Starmer, for example, last week was talking about, the Russians are on the brink because, they only had 3,000 tanks. They had 3,000 tanks going into the war, and now they're down to about 1,000 and something tanks. And we just need to keep going. The Russians are not using tanks in this war. This war is not being fought with tanks. It's being fought with drones, and it's being fought with missiles. Yeah. And it's being fought with digging in and building fortifications and waiting for the enemy to exhaust themselves, and then you move forward and then you extend the fortifications.
Yeah, it's very World One-ish in a way, the way this war has been conducted.
Absolutely. And I think Trump now understands. So you consider that the U.S. defense budget, the amount of money that the U.S. is currently spending on defense, is less than what the U.S. is currently spending on servicing its debt. Now, Trump is of the view that he wants to go to Russia and China with a deal. And the deal is we all have very obvious commitments in our budgets, our national budgets, around what we are spending on defense. And Trump is saying, he's proposing to them that everyone does a 50% reduction in the amount of money that they are spending. So Trump knows two things that will happen as a result. Reducing the U.S. budget by 50% means immediately that's money that can then be plowed back into servicing the debt and pulling out the legs from underneath it as quickly as possible. Correct. The other thing that he's aware of is that with 50% of the money in the hands of the technocrats that he currently has, and I'm looking very specifically at Peter Beale and Palantir at this level. And, right now, if I had any spare cash that I was able to move outside the country, Palantir. I'd put it into Palantir. That they will be able to deliver significantly better outcomes in terms of weaponry for far less money. So you have to look at it from the perspective of what is Trump trying to do by insisting that there's rapprochement with Russia and with China, because he actually recognizes that the Ukraine war has shown that the U.S. doesn't have what it takes to be able to maintain a conventional war against either of those parties.
The other thing is they don't have, it's not even about resource necessarily in terms of physical resource. It's about will and want.
Yes.
The reality is if you look at, we went through an interesting phase in terms of war and warfare. World War I was trench warfare. World War II, we had trench warfare, but there was also tanks, and there were planes, and there were better arms, etc., automatic machine guns, etc. And then we go through sort of Korea and the Vietnam War and all the other skirmishes that happen on the sides of those things. And warfare gets, inverted commas, very advanced. And so we get to a point where we think into Iraq and Afghanistan, and then there's a sudden change because the enemy who is less advanced realizes we need to use the fact that we are less advanced to our advantage instead of trying to be more advanced. And so we end up at the Ukraine war, Russia war now, where we're almost, as I say, back to World War I. We're back to those strategies. Even though, yes, there's tech, there's drones, there's missiles, etc. But at the end of the day, we're on the battlefield taking painstaking steps forward and backwards, losing thousands upon thousands of men in the same way as we did in World War I and World War II. And I think Trump looks at that and goes, this would be unsustainable. If we went to war, if we did what Europe wants to do, which is make Ukraine part of NATO, trigger Article 5, and we all go to war against Russia, which then involves China, which almost invariably will choose Russia's side. And we end up in a world war. You hope in some respects that it ends with nuclear war because at least it's over quickly for all of us. But if it ends the way it started, it's millions upon tens of millions of men going to the front lines on both sides to fight each other, being murdered by drones and missiles for no end and no purpose. And I think Trump sees that. I think he sees that's the result.
So you've actually summed up the Ukraine conflict perfectly. And that's what most of these leftist social media accounts and leftist media in general are completely missing the mark. To go back to the point that Starmer was talking about the fact that the Russians lost tanks. The Russians have no interest in tanks at this point. And we'll also understand that from an air superiority perspective, the Russians are out and away the best in the world right now, because even the Ukrainians, by their own admission, admit that the Russian fighter jets are significantly better than the U.S. fighter jets. And the reason why they know that is because the Ukrainian pilots, when they still had Ukrainian pilots before they were shot down.
You mean when they weren't making up myth about those
the ghost of Kiev? Oh God, let's not go there. But the point is that the top Ukrainian pilots had the opportunity of flying the Soviet aircraft and then flying the American aircraft as well, and they were very clear that in terms of maneuverability and in terms of just by every measure. Now, consider that the Russians are not making use of their aircraft in this war. Why are they not making? Because they understand that you have a swarm of drones will easily take out an aircraft, no matter how good it is.
Yeah,
it's like flying into a swarm of pigeons.
Yeah.
I don't care how
it's a bird strike.
It's a bird strike. Yeah, but it's an artificial bird strike, which means that your reliance on So even if you had F-35s in there, an F-35 is still going to get taken out if you have a pigeon that flies into its intake, right?
Correct.
So I think Trump gets this at a level that none of the people in Europe actually understand at this point.
All right, that brings us to the controversy, which, maybe we don't need to get into in too much detail because we like digging deep. And this is very surface level. But obviously, the big story was Zelensky goes to the Oval. Now, there are two things I'd like you to do if you're not on my page on this. And my page is very much that I think Trump and JD were in the right position and they didn't do anything wrong. But if you don't have that position, please go watch the entire thing, not the last 5 minutes, for the full 40 minutes.
So we're talking about the final presser that was given by Trump and Vance. And
there's two things I want people
Zelensky,
to watch, which is the full thing, in which several times Zelensky taunts and probes the Americans inappropriately.
So I don't want to use words like taunt and so.
He did though.
No, I understand that, but the problem is that you and I can agree that he was taunting, and you'll have someone
else
saying,
will say no, he wasn't.
No, he was being brave.
He was just being brave. I got you. All right. So watch the whole thing.
Yeah.
And then there's a 18-minute interview Rubio did on CNN with Caitlin Collins.
Oh, that was excellent.
Okay.
Yes.
You watch the two together. It's an hour of your time. I realize that's quite a lot, but if you care that much about Ukraine, you'll do this. You watch the full hour, 40 minutes Trump, Zelensky, and Vance, and then and Rubio was in the room, and then you watch the Rubio interview, and then take your view on it. My view, having watched the full thing, having listened to Rubio, is that the whole purpose was that Zelensky was there to sign an agreement. He had agreed at that point to sign 3 times. Twice before, agreed and reneged. This was the 3rd time. Fine, come in person, put your name on the signature. We'll make a big thing of it. We'll do a whole lunch at the White House, basically. And he used it as an opportunity to basically upstage the whole process. And there's even not evidence that he met with Democrat lawmakers.
The single thing that we need to draw people's attention to, if you want an accurate assessment of how terrible this was, at the point at which Zelensky goes off the rails, just look across at the Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S. and
with her head in her hands,
and she buries her head in her hands, and you can visibly see it's like, oh my God, what the fuck is this guy doing right now? It really was that point that, you could see that they went in there hoping to close this deal and get on with things.
Yeah.
So I just want to, backtrack a bit out here and explain what the issues were that were actually involved. Because generally when you have these conferences that follow talks, this is just to give to people an outline of the conclusions that have been reached from the talks. So it's not when you, in a legal context, for example, you've gone through the trial, and at the end of the trial, you come to the verdict and the sentencing. And the verdict is not an opportunity to rehear the evidence. So what we had was Trump and Vance going in with Zelensky on the understanding that an agreement in principle had been reached in the discussions, and they were going to be telling the world about the agreement. Instead, Zelensky used the opportunity to say, but now can I start pointing out the stuff that Putin has done? Can I start telling you why Putin is bad? And that was the point at which Vance actually steps in and says, no, actually, we need to get to the point of finalizing an agreement. Now, let's just talk about the agreement for a second.
Yes.
Okay.
Fine.
And here's the reason why the agreement is crucial. Trump recognizes that the U.S. has poured. Trump says, effectively about $300 billion down a sinkhole. What he wants to do now is to come up with a way that he can incentivize having an American presence in Ukraine proper without turning it into a military standoff with Russia. And the easiest thing that he can do is he gets Ukraine to commit to a deal where they say, over a particular period, we are going to allow the U.S. to exploit mineral rights in our territory. And that's the point at which, when Trump then sits down with Putin, he says, all right, we recognize that you have taken these territories on that side, and we're very happy to say that we are not going to turn that into an issue on the global stage. But we want you to recognize that we now have a vested interest in Ukraine, and it is an economic interest, and we are going to be exploiting those interests.
And defending those interests.
Now let's talk in terms of actually settling this war at this point. And it's a very sensible thing to do because it doesn't involve things like security guarantees. It involves recognition of Russia's economic interest in not prosecuting a war and the U.S.'s economic interest in not prosecuting a war. And the outcome of that effectively is security for what's left of Ukraine. And it has to be what's left of Ukraine, because Ukraine is never going to get back to
This is what people don't get. And this is what you have elucidated better than anyone else I've seen, which is there's this pipe dream that somehow it's possible that everything goes back to pre-2022 borders. And that's just not going to happen anymore. It's not going to happen because Russia has secured those areas that it wants. Many of those areas are arguably disputed anyway. And the longer this goes on, this is the other thing that is insane about Zelensky, is that the longer he pushes this on, the more of Ukraine he loses. This is the point you made on the last podcast. He risks losing so much of Ukraine that it becomes pointless almost to have Ukraine. And I really hope that, so-called cool heads prevail. That meeting didn't look like cool heads. When you threaten Trump that he'll eventually feel it across his nice ocean, I mean, that was a dumb statement to make. But the sooner this ends, the sooner the death stops, which is obviously repeatedly what Trump has said he wants to do, stop people from dying. But the sooner Ukraine stops losing territory, it will. The minute it loses that territory, it's not getting it back. That's not going to be part of a deal. I don't know how else to tell people that.
Well, Trump recognizes that Ukraine by itself, no matter what type of weapons get given to Ukraine is incapable of winning this war. And I cannot say this often enough.
Unless you destroy the earth with World War III, which is he has also stated.
Yes, but that would actually require that you do what the British and the Europeans are now saying they want to do, which is to put boots on the ground. But remember, they are saying they will put boots on the ground after a ceasefire. Yeah. They're not committing to putting boots on the ground.
Peacekeeping forces, right?
Russia's not going to accept a peacekeeping force of Europeans out there. Because
on their border, for the same reason they didn't want NATO on their border.
Yeah. So because Russia is very clear that their aim is to demilitarize Ukraine so that Ukraine does not pose a threat. And would Russia consider British troops on Ukrainian soil to be less of a threat than Ukrainian troops? No, absolutely not. On the other hand, would Russia be willing to strike a deal with the Trump administration that says, okay, we're recognizing that you are going to be operating in that part of the country, and we are going to be operating on our side of the newly established borders, and we will recognize that you are not going to be a military threat, and that what you are doing is going to be exploiting the resources of Ukraine in the interests of the American investment into Ukraine. And yes, we can strike a deal along those lines.
Yeah.
Because that fits in with our objectives, which is to have a Ukraine which is not a threat to us. And it aligns with your objectives, which is to have Ukraine as part of the Western world and to be able to make use of the resources of Ukraine. And half of Ukraine is still bigger than most of the rest of Europe put together.
All right, Kanthan. I think we've got other stuff I know we wanted to talk about, but I've run out of time. We've run out of studio time. We'll try record sooner, the next one, for all the fans.
Yeah, we didn't get to touch on Middle East, and I think that's going to be the most crucial thing we need to...
Huge conversation. There's massive stuff happening there. There's actually a developing war going on there yesterday. Basically, the Israelis have taken, as we know, mountains into Syria. That has created a buffer zone for Israel, but it's also created a buffer zone for southern Syria. In southern Syria are the Druze, who are an ethnic group, and they have traditionally been persecuted.
Well, you might remember on one of the last episodes, I said that, to my mind, it's better off for the Druze if Israel controls their territory than for...
So basically, it looks as if Israel's going to protect the Druze from their new position, which is going to obviously create conflict between the force that's trying to kill the Druze, which is Turkish-backed.
Yes.
Basically from Erdogan, which is a NATO state. So this is complicated and a discussion we definitely need to have in the next podcast. But for now, I think we have to be done. So thank you.
Freedom Front Plus's new leader, any thoughts?
I think it's good. I think it's good. I heard one comment made by Peter Groenewald, which was that a lot of the people coming in are young. And he thinks that that's a positive thing. And I tend to agree. I made that comment about Kali Kriel in comparison to Ernst Roots. And Ernst Roots has since been on Tucker Carlson. You look at Ernst make the case on Tucker Carlson, and you look at Kali Kriel making the case. Chalk and cheese, right?
Look, I seriously recommend people listen to Ernst Roots and
100%.
And Tucker Carlson.
But I tell you why there's that difference. There's an older generation who just don't get social media, and they don't get the way to spread the message in long form as well as a younger generation in general. I'm saying this to a man who's 900 years old, but but for the most part, I look at how JD Vance responds to Twitter and the way he deals with the same type of fake news and criticism that Trump gets. JD's just that much better at dealing with it. The way he manages it is just excellent. And so I think that younger generation coming through is really important. I think that's good. I think there's a sense that the Freedom Front Plus might actually be willing to embrace being conservative, being on the right, being open about that. And the truth is, I think the country might be ready for that. I think a lot of people are done with the DA's flirtation with globalism constantly, their inability to put South Africans first, their inability to drop pet issues, which are not important to the majority here. And I think that there's an opportunity. One thing I will say is that the Freedom Front Plus needs to be the Vryhond... sorry, I'm screwing this up. Say it for me.
The Freedom Front Plus.
No, in Afrikaans.
The Vryheidsfront.
Vryheidsfront, sorry. Apologies there. My Afrikaans left me. It needs to be the Vryheidsfront Plus for the Afrikaans people, and it needs to be the very much Freedom Front Plus for the English. And they need to learn how to split the party into those two things. They have to be able to attract the white English-speaking middle class, as well as they attract the white Afrikaans-speaking middle class.
I think there's a significant body of black conservatives within the country right now.
Yes.
Who
would consider them as well.
Yes.
I'm not discounting them at all. And I'm not saying it should be a white race-based party.
No, not
in
at
the
all.
least.
But what I'm saying is, and this is something you and I have touched on,
Yes.
is that there is a need for a solid, let's use two words, conservative in the sense of a traditional view of conservatism, which is committed to what Sihle Ngobese keeps referring to, faith, family, friends, and
faith,
freedom.
family, flag, and freedom.
And freedom, yes. Yeah. And I think there's a strong enough body of people across all race groups who are looking for a political home that does that, and not the painted sidewalks of the Democratic Alliance.
Correct.
Yeah. And, last thing, there was a tweet
You're
by...
pushing your luck here.
No, I'm pushing my luck. Koshi Karan had a tweet this morning.
Yes.
Tucker Carlson with Ernst Rutz is at 3 million views in under 24 hours. Legacy media is getting crushed, bleeding money, fast becoming irrelevant. Independent creators aren't the future. They hold all the power now. Media houses who adapt will survive. I don't think that last point is true. I don't believe the media houses are capable of adapting and surviving.
And on that note, please like and subscribe to this podcast. Share it with your friends. We are getting very good traction. I went to a big function over the weekend, and some random person said to me they're really enjoying the podcast. I went somewhere else, and someone not so random, a friend, said that he's really liking the podcast. So it is certainly spreading. We really do appreciate it. Spread it around, because we are that independent media that Koshik's referring to. Not quite Tucker Carlson levels there yet, but we shall get there. I certainly hope I will never laugh like him. I don't think you do either. Kanthan, as always, thank you. We'll catch you next time. Cheers.
Cheers.